Hello, and welcome to the 6th video in this Twitter integration series. In this video I'm going to focus on how to display an archive control inside 6web on the Twitter page. I'm also going to show how the archive provider is used to populate the archive control with data. I'm also going to show you how to define the columns that are displayed inside the archive control. Lastly, I'll discuss some of the archive control features that, when supported by an archive provider, are used to display on an archive control. By that I mean archive provider entities that enable a filtering capability. Basically, they're displayed as a checkbox in the lower right hand corner that load corresponding entity data into the control when they're checked. As with all controls in 6web development, let's switch over to the Visual Studio and begin modifying the twitterpage.config file to display an archive control on the Twitter page. So here we are inside Visual Studio looking at our Twitter page. It's exactly like it was in the previous videos. I haven't made any other modifications to it yet. In the last video we were talking about data handlers. You can see how we use the data handler here in this Esso script control in order to display the login dialog. Now what we want to do is go ahead and add in one more control onto this page in order to display the archive control. So let's go ahead and add in an archive control and take a look at that. I'm going to go ahead and place that right above the Esso script control, and I'll just pause for a second so I can paste that on, and then we'll come right. Okay. So the bare minimum in order to get a Esso archive control to show up on the page is essentially to add in an Esso archive control. I do that by declaring a new control element, and I'll just give it an ID called Twitter archive. This becomes actually quite important, this ID, later on when configuring the menus and click events. I'm also going to declare the type as an Esso archive control. For positioning, I want this control to take up the entire space available on that page. So I'm going to go ahead and specify width as 100%, top 0, left 0, height as 100%, and the position absolute. What's most important for a archive control is the config section. The config section essentially defines who is going to populate, or who's responsible for populating this control with data, and essentially how it's going to be leveraged. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and set 3 restrictions, and all of these restrictions are going to be passed off to my archive provider. And this archive provider is going to make these available so that inside my archive provider, I can go ahead and get access to this data in order to be used when I'm trying to provide some archive rows for this control. In this case, very similar to what we were using for our dialog, I'm going to get the name of the application name, the device name, and the device ID. So these all correspond to the foreign keys, and I'm going to pass these off as restrictions into my archive control. I'm going to specify the name, and then the operator equals, and then the binding is data, which is then going to be fetched from my entities, my credential entity. Remember, that's if we go back up and we look in the solution inside for our credentials carrier, the data handler is going to actually get the values and populate these properties of this type, and then it's going to be stored inside the data handler's data carrier collection. So this control is going to be able to access that data handler, then the data carrier's collection, in order to get access to the application name, the device name, and the device ID properties of that credential entity object. I'm going to go ahead and pass that up into my archive provider, and these will be set via the archive provider's set restrictions method. Now, the provider's name element is probably the most important, because that specifies the archive provider that's responsible for populating this control. We also need an archive column info, or data source, to populate our columns for this archive control. And I'm going to go ahead and specify that name equal to a data handler that I still have yet to display on this page. It will be called archive control column config data handler dot Twitter archive. So just like any other data handler that you're used to, we have an archive column config data handler that is not shown anywhere, but it's leveraged by the system in order to control or contain the definitions or column definitions for every archive provider in the system. Now these column definitions are maintained in a another configuration file, and we're going to take a look at that very shortly. But first, let's go ahead and see what happens if you try and include this without actually declaring the archive provider. So we've made the changes to our page, and we're ready to save this. And then if we switch back over to our browser, we go over to company, and then we'll switch back to Twitter, we want to see what happens. We'll get a error message that says, whoops, data handler with this ID has not been found. That's right, it's not found because I haven't actually declared it at the top of the page yet. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to come underneath the last data handler that's defined on our page. I'll just make a new entry. I'll paste this in. It's going to define the archive column config data handler. Subtype, and this is again referencing the mapping name inside the object mapping config file. Archive column config data handler. And then I'm going to specify in the config section for this data handler an archive column info. And this is going to say, hey, grab me the column definitions from the provider that is Twitter, where the GUI name equals Twitter archive. To see these values for the GUI name Twitter archive, we have to actually go to the Esso archive column list config file. So Esso archive column list. We double click on this. We'll see here is where you define all of the columns that are available for an archive provider. We'll see an archive element has a provider name, and then it has a GUI name, and that directly maps to what we saw here in the page data handler definition in the config section for this archive column info. It's going to look for provider name Twitter and GUI name Twitter archive. So now we have to specify that here inside this file. So I'm going to go ahead and just make a new entry here. And I'll specify a new archive element. I'll give it a provider name of Twitter. I'll give it a GUI name of Twitter archive. And then I'm going to specify essentially 3 different types of columns. I'm going to specify my mandatory columns, my default columns, and my ignore columns. My mandatory ones, I'll specify it has to show at least the user that created this Twitter entry, this tweet, and then the text of that tweet. For the default columns, I'll also show the created date and the source, so the client that this was submitted from. And then I'll ignore the tweet ID. So where are these column definitions actually coming from? Well, it's an Esso archive control, so you have to imagine the data is coming from this archive provider. So let's take a look at that for a second. So here's the Twitter archive provider. I've got a few using statements here. You'll notice that I'm again using the DimeBrain TweetSharp library in order to gain access to the Twitter resources. An archive provider declared with an archive provider attribute. The provider name is Twitter. And the columns I've specified are declared here. I have essentially 5 columns. Tweet ID, one for the user, one for the text, the source, and the created date. So this is where my column definitions are actually originally defined inside the archive provider, and then it's up to me in order to define those also inside the Esso archive column list.config file and specify whether or not they are required, i.e. mandatory, shown by default, or ignored. I will go ahead and cover some more of the implementation here inside this archive provider as it's required throughout this video, but I just want to come here and show you the actual column definitions for now. Now, some of the terms used here inside the archive provider might seem foreign to you. For example, archive column info or archive row and things of that nature. But be aware that there is a very good video available for that to learn about the basics of archive providers. If you go to the main site of DevNet and then you click on the video tutorials link, if you scroll down to the 6 web series, I'm sorry, a little bit before that, right, the net server series, there's this introduction to archive providers. It was actually a session that was held by Marek of SuperOffice R&D, and this is probably the best resource in order to learn about general construction of archive providers and how they work and why they work that way. So let's go ahead, we'll go back to the website and make sure, first I'll go back to the code and make sure that we saved all of our changes. So the column list definition is there. We've got our page definition, which now has the archive column config data handler defined. So now it should be able to discover our column definitions, and then when we load this page, it's going to go ahead and pass off these restrictions to the archive provider and then show the control. So let's see if all that's working. I'll click on Twitter. Remember, there was an error, so I'm going to have to log back in. This error was from the last time, and the Twitter data handler not found. Alright, okay, so this is coming on to our page, so that must mean that we actually don't have the Twitter archive provider defined. So let's go ahead and define that now. For some reason it looks like that was taken away somewhere between the last video and this video, so not sure why, but let's go ahead and just add that back on there. I'll come back, I'll save that, go to the website, and we should be able to hopefully log in successfully this time. Great, we were, and in fact now we are showing the Esso archive control on our Twitter page. Now, I have done this before, so I've logged in and my credentials are stored in the database. We went through that in the last video, and it's now able to see the tweets from the people I'm following. Okay, now that we have the archive control loaded with data from our archive provider, let's discuss these entity options down here in the lower right hand corner. You can see I have 4 displayed: public, friends, own, and mentions. And these correspond to the capabilities you have for viewing tweets at the Twitter website. So we have the option to see all public data, which is available for everyone. Essentially they're just tweets that are coming in randomly. And then you have the friends, which are the people that you are following. And then you also have the option to show tweets made by yourself, as well as tweets anywhere your name is mentioned, or anywhere my name is mentioned. So how do we enable these checkboxes inside the archive control? We do these specifically inside the archive provider. If we come back to the archive provider code, we'll do that by adding in these entity info objects, archive entity infos. Now, in the constructor of my archive provider, you can see I'm doing a couple things here. I'm instantiating an instance of a column helper, and I'm also instantiating an instance of an entity helper. And that essentially allows me to control the entities that I want to associate with each one of the rows inside my archive control. What that means is, if we look back at the archive control, every single one of these records, every one of these rows, have a defined entity associated with it. One of these rows might be a friends row, a record that is data belonging to someone I am following, as well as another record or row inside this archive control can be one whose entity is one that has mentions me. If we go back to the code, these four entities, I'm creating one that's public, I'm creating one for friends, I'm creating one for my own, and also creating one for mentions. These are just string constants that are defined up above: public, friends, mentions, and owns. And I use these a little bit later. What's most important here is the third option, or the third parameter, called isOptional. As long as you set this to true, then you're telling the archive provider, or the archive control that will consume this archive provider, that this entity can be leveraged to filter the content inside the archive control. How do I do that? Well, that's done essentially down here inside the getRows method of the archive provider, and I'm going to check if I'm going to check essentially this desired entities element, and I'll get that via looking into my entities helper desired entities property, which, as you can see, is a string array. So instead of searching through those manually, I'll just go ahead and cast those into a list, which I can use this nice contains method in order to define or determine whether or not my archive control is requesting this entity type. So I'm going to say, okay, if desired entities contains public, go ahead and get me via the tweetsharp library, give me all of the public tweets. If the desired entities is friends, go ahead and get me all of my friends tweets, and so on, for my own as well as anywhere I'm mentioned. So I'll go ahead and build those up, do any filtering if necessary, sort some rows if necessary, and then set some entity rows here. We'll look at that a little bit later. And now I'll go ahead and just return those items. So that essentially is the functionality between an Esso archive control, or the features of an Esso archive control, that are directly reflected from an archive provider. So now if I go ahead and check own, you'll see that the archive control is going to refresh, and it's also going to include tweets that I created as well, not just where I'm mentioned. Okay. So that's the basic requirements in order to get an Esso archive control displayed on your pages and populate those archive controls with data from an archive provider. In subsequent videos, we're going to look at how to enable right-clicking on the header. Right now I'm right-clicking on this header where it's text, nothing is displaying. But what we want to show is the configure columns context menu that will allow me to configure the columns that are displayed, as well as any sorting I want to implement. We're also going to take a look at how to create the toolbar buttons down here on the archive control, down on the bottom left. And then we'll also look at how to manipulate certain actions, specifically our current values, when we do a single click on a record in the archive control, as well as when we do a double click operation, and what we want to happen when we do that. So stay tuned, look out for videos 7 and above in order to see how to do that. Thanks for watching.